Week two. That'll be this. Well, meeting two. Meeting two is going to be on skin weighting. It's definitely not good vibes. It's Dara crossed that out because she had the final say on that. Can you all see it effectively? Is it like flickering or is it buffering up for you guys when I'm cycling through the slides real quick?
It
You're
looks
all
good.
good.
Okie dokie, awesome. Roman, if you'd like to take it away from here.
I shall take it away. So, what is skin weighting? From the basic sound of it and from everyone's kind of basic knowledge of it, it's just binding the skeleton through to the geometry of the model and through binding the skin. And then you got to paint the weights of the skin to affect how the model will deform when moving the skeleton. And like the more important part is the actual setup. So first things first is make sure your UVs are finalized before painting your skin weights. And also make sure your topology is good to go and is like a good balance between low and high poly, because this can really, it can judge how easy or how hard it'll be to rig your character. And so first, bind the skin. And so this is the process of attaching the model to your selected skeletons and joints. And found under the rigging menu, go to skin, bind skin, and there's a bunch of options there. Check your bind skin settings before skinning. You will likely see change settings based on your workflow and your project. Select the joints you want to be affected, and then one more or deformable message, and then bind skin. And so here are the different options for whenever you want to start binding your joints to your skin. So joint hierarchy will, the selected joint, all the joints beneath it in the hierarchy will be skinned. Selected joints means that all the joints you have selected will be skinned. And object hierarchy includes joint and non-joint transformation nodes in the hierarchy. And there's different bind methods too after this. So closest distance binds vertices to the closest joint regardless of where it is in the hierarchy. Closest in hierarchy binds verts using the actual joint hierarchy, thus searching for parents and children of the current joint to use as influences. The heat map treats each joint like a heat source and works best when joints are inside of a mesh. And geodesic voxel, Maya creates a voxel-based version of the mesh to help calculate the skin weights.
Yeah, so alongside that, we have some bind skin options for a quick rundown on that. So you have your skinning methods, there's your classic linear, your default basic smooth skin deformation, which allows some volume shrinking and collapse deformation, dual quaternion, which is used to preserve volume when deforming around joints that twist, and then weight blended, a blend between the two above. You can shift these skinning methods in your Maya viewport. If you click on an object that has a skin cluster on it, you can click. You should have a drop-down menu that can change this. In an example where you would use classic linear over dual quaternion, Josh Sobel did a face rigging course, and when we got to the eyelids, I believe he did mention to use classic linear for the eyelids, because if you had dual quaternion on and you rotated your proper eyelids, it would kind of create like a circular shape that would kind of bulge out from the eye, but classic linear kind of allows it to just fold over the eyeball a bit more. Normalizing weights. So when you have an interactive weight mode on, it Maya adds or distributes weights to keep a total influence of 100% or 1.0, and it renormalizes after each stroke made in painting weights. And if you notice that, and you'll probably notice that this is why whenever you use the smooth tool, you'll have a bunch of weights just shoot around all over your joints, because it will shoot weight influence over your unlocked joints. No normalization turns off normalization unless you create weights more or less than 1.0. I don't know. I have never used none. I don't know any. I haven't really asked people if they've used none, so I can't really speak much on the usefulness of that. Post weights, it allows skin normalization to occur after you deform the mesh. I have used post before, and I'll go into where I've used post before, but it can be, and it's kind of a jank setup, but it is good for pretty quick skin weighting, in my opinion. Weight distribution. It's only available when your normalized weights is set to your interactive mode. Distance. It calculates new weights based on the distance of the vertex to joints it's skinned to. and neighbors. It calculates new weights based on influences affecting surrounding vertices. So another for bind skin options on a quick rundown. We have a multiple bind poses. It's self-explanatory. It's useful if you're binding multiple pieces of geometry to the same skeleton. Max influences. It specifies the number of joints that can influence each vertex. Maintain max influences. It doesn't allow for a number of influences greater than what's specified in max influences. Remove unused influences. It would weighted influence that would have 0 weighting aren't included in the bind. So if it's like if the auto bind just is not going to give it any weight, it'll just be removed. So it can cause a little bit of funkiness, but you can always add joints to an influence later on. Colorized skeleton. It's a matter of preferences, and if you want to have a rainbow skeleton to show which joints are bound and which aren't, go ahead. It's usually a pretty good indicator, but usually you can just see that in a list format when you open the Paint Skin Weights tool, so it's just there for visuals. Include hidden selections on creation. If you want to bind geometry that's hidden. Drop-off rate. It specifies how rapidly the influence of each joint on a vertex decrease with the distance from the joint. So yeah, I don't touch many of these pretty often, since it kind of affects the default bind, and usually I'm starting from scratch with paint skinning, with skin weights. So next we go to painting skin weights and the Maya default method. More than likely, you're not going to want to stick to Maya's default right after binding the skin. You'll want to go in and edit it yourself, because sometimes you'll have a T-pose and you will grab your shoulder and it'll start ripping the side out of the character, and it's not a good look. So, so under the rigging menu, you can go to Skin Paint Weights tool and click on the option box to open up this little window here. Or you can click on your geometry, right click and hold, and then you'll have a new box up in the upper left hand corner of your marking menu to let you open up the new window of the Paint Skin Weights tool. So your default Paint Skin Weights tool, it shows all your joints in a hierarchy affected with the geometry you selected. It'll list it like this, and it can be a bit of a hassle to run through, especially if you're on like a Mac and your trackpad isn't going to let you scroll through, so you'll often have to click here. It's a bit of a pain. So your brush settings, you can hold B and left click and drag to control the size of your brush, and your paint operations are replace, add, scale, and smooth. Alongside that, your opacity, value, and flood will be touched the most. But as for workflow, we have 2 examples here. So there are multiple ways to go about it, as long as it's efficient for you. One example is to flood all the weights to the root joint of the hierarchy of the whole model, and that'll just reset your entire skin weights, and only your root joint will be affected will affect the skin. Then you'll lock all the joints besides the root and unlock the next joint you'd like to start painting weights on. So if you want to start painting at the hip, then you'll put all the weights of like the hip area all the way up to the head and the arms, and leave the legs there, and then go up. You'll want to keep all influences locked at all times aside from the ones you're working on. And when you're done with an area, you'll lock the weights to make it easier and linear for your workflow. So it's you're going to be kind of going in you're probably gonna have like 2 or 3 joints unlocked at a time in that case. Then you'll want to animate your controls and move your joints around to see if your deformations at extreme points. -90 and 90 degrees tend to work pretty well. If you really want to test it, you can go to like 120. Switching between selecting vertices to flood weights and painting them to smooth out weights is a pretty good idea. Typically I usually just flood an entire joint to have a certain amount of weight, and then I'll just click off the model with the basic model and just hit the smooth button from there to see what that gets me, and then just work from there. You'll want to work with an unsmooth model to paint directly on the vertices, and then check how your deformations look in smooth preview. And it's a personal preference, but using add and scale instead of replace, because replace can be very funky with where it places the weight value in Maya. This is an alternate workflow that's pretty jank, but it works well for me when I want to get a good first pass of weights up. After you've added all your weights and you haven't smoothed anything out, like with the smooth tool, you can change your normalize weights option right here to from interactive to post. So now you can, your joints won't normalize, and you will not be affecting the weights of other joints as you paint them. So when you do that, you can basically just have more than 100% weight on a joint. So by doing that, you don't have to worry about stray weights getting thrown around the skin and thrown on other joints. And once you do that, you can just smooth through the entire hierarchy in one go. And then afterwards, I usually just switch back to Maya switch back to interactive normalized weights. And once it does that, it's, at least for me, it's given me a pretty good baseline of weights to work with. So you can just kind of go to polish from there. It's pretty solid for quick painting if you need a first pass of skin weights up pretty soon. But Dara, if you'd like to take it from here for some tips and tricks.
Yes, of course. So going off of still Maya's default tools and stuff, talking about like you can mirror your skin weights, so that can be efficient for your workflow. So especially if you're working on a symmetrical model, so you can work entirely on like one side of the mesh and then like not worry about the other side, because you can just simply mirror those same weights to the other side. So that's kind of like a fast, efficient way to go about skinning. Copying skin weights can be kind of used in a bunch of different applications. For example, I can use it kind of as a good starting base for clothing. If your clothes have similar topology to your model's body, if there is geometry under your clothing, but like essentially if your clothing is just going to be using like skin weights, I like using copy skin weights from the body to the clothing to kind of get a good base and then kind of polish skinning from there. And then of course you can edit your influences. So whenever you bind skin with your joints to the model, it doesn't have to just like be just those influences. Like you can add more joints if you're kind of editing your rig, or like take out influences if you accidentally added joints to your bind skin. So that can be a way to kind of go about that. And then of course remember that you have your weight hammer that can help fix stray vertices, that just like the one or two vertices that just don't want to be painted for whatever reason. You can use the weight hammer to kind of help that. And then also, in general, painting weights doesn't only apply to skinning, but you can paint weights on your deformers, your blend shapes, lattices, clusters, delta mush, etc. And that workflow might just be the same. And then another important tool to skinning is the component editor, and that's found under Windows, General Editors, Component Editor. And essentially, it's a table graph that shows you all the vertices that you've selected and their weights. And this could be like weights for like anything, but to see your specific skin weights, you'd have to go to the Smooth Skins tab. And then on it, you'll see like all the vertices that you've selected, all the influences that are on that vertice, and then the total at the very end, which if you have it like especially on interactive, you'll see the total add up to 1.0. So in this graph, you can select your vertices and then type in a numeric value that you would like for the skin weights. Again, if you're working in interactive, it'll probably be between 0 and 1. And I find this to be a very useful tool for making your weights like all the same for the vertices you've selected, or like fixing some rogue vertices, or like other niche situations. And just like, or this could be just like a really quick way of doing skinning. And theoretically, you could do all of your skinning in the component editor if you wanted to. And then, is there a way to make skinning easier? Not exactly, because painting skin weights is the most tedious part about rigging. I don't really see that there's much automation for skinning as there is for like building your skeleton, But there are definitely some advanced tools and scripts out there that can help with your workflow. Some that I know of would be like NG Skin Tools, and that one uses like layers and has a better mirroring system. And then there's also Brave Rabbit's Smooth Weights tool. Yeah. Any comments or questions? Or if anyone knows any like other tools or methods, we can also talk about that.
I was just gonna say I'm really glad you mentioned the BR smooth weights. Yeah, personally I have very little patience when it comes to skin weights, and that has been like a huge help for me, just like um filling in my weights solidly. At first just I bind with uh only one influence per vertice, and then clean it up and then do the BR smooth weights. So yeah, for me that's a personal favorite.
Nice. I've actually never used Brave Rabbit's tool, but I've been like itching to.
It saves you so much
I
time.
Yes,
To go use
I
it.
will.
Yeah.
Forget regular skimming. Stop
Yeah.
wasting your time. Just go use the tool.
So for like simulating muscle and stuff, it's a whole other system inside of Maya that goes on top of what you have with skin weighting. So you have to have the same like rig setup, and you still have to paint weights, unfortunately. But what doing a muscle setup does is it'll simulate a lot of stuff like skin sliding and like muscle bulges and all of that that goes on underneath the skin, that you could do with like blend shapes.
Okay.
So it automates a lot of that. For like body fat and like jiggling, they're jiggle deformers, and you can use those. But again, the more stuff that you have on a rig, the heavier it's going to be and the slower it's going to be to animate. So a lot of times what they'll do is you'll have like two rigs. You'll have one with muscles and fat and all that kind of simulations, and then a rig without it. So the animators can work without it while they're working. And then when it's time to render, they swap it out and take the rig with the muscle simulation and like jiggle and all that, and render that.
But what if it's like on the cartoony spectrum? You know, like what about a stylized jiggle or something that's low poly or low? I don't know. You know, I don't want the consistency of Jello, but I want it to feel like a good flop.
You can play with the settings of the deformer to get it how you want.
Okay. All right.
You can also change the jiggle in like your muscle setup so that the muscles bounce. So that could be an easier way to do it. Like make a muscle, I'm going to use air quotes, a muscle for like the belly. And then as the weight shifts around, that muscle will jiggle, but it's actually simulating belly fat, not muscle.
Okay.
If you Google Maya muscle, you'll come up with a lot of stuff about how to use that.
All right. Well, thank you. I was like kind of multitasking right now, so you probably heard a lot.
No worries.
Yeah, thanks for sharing the answer on that.
Yeah, no problem. I haven't done like a full character with muscle simulation, but I've done like tests with it. And it's kind of fun. I just haven't had a use because I like cartoonier stuff and I like blend shapes. So I normally deal with stuff with blend shapes.